Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Dual Aspects. I'm Sean and I'm joined here again by Dawson. And today we are jumping right in back where we left off last time and getting deeper into the question of continental and analytic philosophy and why Dawson believes that the distinction is artificial and how a cross fertilization between these two camps can help us rediscover what we mean when we speak of time and space and causality and other such abstract terms in modern science. Welcome back, Dawson.
Great to be back so we can dive right into this major problem of the 20th century in philosophy.
Yeah, tell me something about why you think we shouldn't make this distinction, or that this distinction between analytic and continental philosophy is somewhat misguided.
I think it's misguided because it creates a schism between camps. It creates a kind of sectarianism in philosophy. So you have what would crudely be called philosophers of science who are concerned with epistemology and logic and the clarification of language and of concepts in physics and linguistics. And then you have, on the other hand, the continentals who are concerned with metaphysics, with interpreting texts like especially Hegel and Kant and Nietzsche. And they're concerned with feeling and sentiment. And the problem, what happens is that these two can't meet. They're like ships passing in the night, even though they're actually concerned with what would be overlap in their research.
Right, okay. Where would you put Karl Popper, speaking of theory of science? Because in one way, he very distinctly is looking at the Logik der Forschung, logic of scientific research. But on the other hand, you could say that in a way he did kind of disprove or debunk large parts of the positivist school of thought.
I think Karl Popper is an exception, and he doesn't fit into these categories in the way that Thomas Kuhn and Feyerabend also do not fit into the categories because even though he's coming from the Vienna Circle, he's writing on Hegel and he's concerned with Plato and classical questions of philosophy. So I think he's not what I would consider the exemplar. I think Ernst Cassirer would be the exemplar since he's steeped in Kant and Einsteinian relativity theory. But Karl Popper definitely goes beyond this dichotomy, I think.
Right. Yeah, I always found it interesting to look at these three, you could say, principal thinkers of theory of science that you've mentioned, so Popper, Kuhn, and Feyerabend, because they exactly show how unusual, you could say, the foundations are that science is built on. So unusual in the sense of they're not what they seem to be. We kind of have developed this kind of, I don't know if scientism is the right word, but this assumption that we have discovered this kind of unchanging truth machine. There's a kind of unchanging, or there's a, you could say, a sort of a meta method, a fundamental similarity of approaches that underlies scientific research that we can point towards in order to distinguish between science and pseudoscience, or an authentic pursuit of truth and a pseudo metaphysical babble. But when if you look into it, it's much more difficult than you think. And this was the whole thing that Husserl referred to as the crisis of European sciences, where it's like, do we have anything that goes beyond the mere institutional, bureaucratic organization of scientific research that binds them together? Is there a kind of a underlying principle? And the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the positivists or the logicists, logistica,
Mhm.
whatever, they attempted to kind of purge language or cleanse language from all kind of metaphysical, non-empirical speculation and create some sort of sterile linguistic tool that would allow us to bind together purely empirical statements that could all be scientifically verified, and thus we could arrive at some kind of final or clean, pure science. In a way, that it's Kantian, because then Kantian also spoke of the possibility of pure natural science and pure mathematics. But the way I understand it is that Popper basically showed that this is not possible. He basically showed that there is only, in his view, a negative criterion. You can only make claims that are not yet disproven, but you cannot make claims that are proven to be true in all cases. So you can either say we have 10 empirical observations and we can make a statement on those 10 observations, but as soon as we want to generalize, we can only generalize insofar we don't find a counterexample. We don't find the black swan. We find 10 white swans, generalize that swans are white, and this theory can only remain valid, as long as we don't encounter a black swan. So
Precisely.
we haven't proven it. We haven't proven it to be valid, and I think that was referred to as the induction problem. But another point was the so-called demarcation problem, where it's like, in order to actually have all of these empirical claims stick together, in order to actually link them together to a generalized theory, you actually do need some kind of metaphysical core to your theory. And ironically, the more metaphysical, the more bold it is, the more powerful your theory becomes, the more empirical claims it can carry. But then it also carries this metaphysical baggage where you're like not sure if that drags you down in the long run, and it becomes difficult to assess whether a theory is sufficiently falsifiable, whether we can actually say this is falsifiable. And that's not even getting into the other thinkers. I'll let you get your
Yes.
word in this.
That's great because yeah, it depends on the criteria. If you're following this criteria that Popper established with the falsifiability criterion, it doesn't really work with Husserl's methodology, which is at different points in his career is the study of consciousness towards pure science, philosophy as a rigorous science, or back to the things themselves, the appearances as they're presented to my consciousness. So it has this degree of which he himself is kind of a lone philosopher because he's still concerned with subjectivity, but not in what is only subjective and private to myself, but what is the contents of my consciousness. So he had the categorical intuition and he had the eidetic reduction. He said these are real essences. This is a transcendental philosophy. It's true of all people with consciousness. He wouldn't say people, of all minds with that are endowed with consciousness. So he's going looking for these categories, bracketing everything in the empirical world. And when he corresponds with Frege, Frege is already saying this is not the domain of logic. Logic is not concerned with psychology at all. We're looking towards clarifying, as you said, the language and making distinctions between sense, Sinn, and Bedeutung, meaning. And he had this in his foundations of arithmetic. So you can already see with Frege and Husserl, there's the beginnings of what could be called the split between the continental and the analytic schools. Is Frege saying we're really here to do logic and nothing else, clarifying our statements, and then Husserl saying, well, I'm concerned with actually something much more fundamental, which is consciousness as such.
Right. Yeah. I think there's also a very obscure thinker of which I haven't seen any English translations. It's a guy named Gotthard Günther. There are some translations, but not all of his work has been translated. And he makes an interesting point there. It's well, I don't know if he makes a point or if he demonstrates something by developing something that he calls kenogrammar, empty grammar. And he just exemplifies that the logic as it is developed from, historically speaking, from Aristotelian metaphysics, it actually has an implicit assumption that there is kind of an asymmetry in your logic. So, for example, if you say this sentence, the self-referential famous liar's paradox, the self-referential sentence that says this sentence for example, that says this sentence is true. That sentence is true. It reinforces itself. But if you say this sentence is false, it's not false, it's actually contradictory. It is neither of them. So there is a kind of asymmetry. There is an asymmetry of truth and falsehood. There is an asymmetry of those modalities, whereas that is something that you potentially can't just extract from the linguistic convention itself. So there's something deeper. There is some deeper sense being carried by this language that is not reducible to definitions within the language. And that is something that went much deeper in the critique of Rudolf Carnap by Kurt Gödel, and that you can find in his collected letters. Anyone who wants to look this up, Solomon Pfefferman, I think, collected them in the 50s. So there he actually says, okay, in order to continue with mathematics in a fruitful manner, we need to make certain assumptions that are not derived from our previous ones. We have to kind of basically just add them, just kind of derive them from our intuition, derive them from our higher, you could say, higher sense of abstract knowledge, or perhaps even a form of revelation. Gödel was kind of a very eclectic thinker in that sense. But for example, true infinities, true uncountable infinities, are something that need to be postulated and added. There is no syntax of the previous mathematical language that could lead you to a true transfinite set of numbers. You cannot count until you reach uncountable infinity. Doesn't work. You can reach a potential infinity, countable infinity, meaning it is just a kind of a logical concept of always being able to add one. But uncountable infinities, meaning sets where you can't order them, there's no clear ordering of how to count through that set to capture everyone. That's a distinction between the rational and the real numbers. A true uncountable infinity is something you need to postulate. And then you actually can generate, it's very generative. You can generate more fruitful mathematical concepts and derive more interesting theorems from it. There's more examples like that. There's another one called the axiom of choice. And all of this is not something you can derive from what the logicists had basically wanted to be the base conventions of language from which to derive a full scientific language. So what you see here is something that Kuhn would probably say is there's a kind of a paradigm that has established itself that is basically the implicit metaphysical core that has become such a kind of second nature. It's almost like the fish that cannot recognize the water he's swimming in. Yeah. It's a second nature that logicists no longer recognize as a form, as something that's derived from anything metaphysical. But as soon as it becomes inadequate, or as soon as there is a clear advantage to expanding upon that paradigm, you suddenly see the importance of metaphysics just kind of becomes so glaringly obvious.
This is perfect, because now we can bring up Wittgenstein here, who is so pivotal to this. So, I mean, going from the beginning of the 20th century, from the foundations of mathematics to Russell and Whitehead, then you have Wittgenstein, because he makes these assertions at a certain point in his famous work, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. He says the proposition is what we're after, which is a fancy way of saying the true sentence statement. And he says there's a point in which a proposition just shows itself. You could say there are simple propositions underlying the larger proposition, these atomic, but he doesn't explain what those are. And he says that it must show itself. And at one point he says, there is indeed the inexpressible. This shows itself. This is the mystical. And this comes late in his Tractatus, which is a treatise on logic, and it's broken into 7 propositions, essentially. And when I get to the end, the 6th proposition onwards, it's really about ethics, aesthetics, and the problems that one faces in life, the problem of life. And so the Vienna Circle, when they decided to sort of appropriate Wittgenstein, they had trouble taking these mystical utterances into account. And it's debated whether or not it's a mystical text, but there is at least one place where he says that explicitly. There is this point in which we run up against the limits of language, and we can no longer express any propositional statement. And this is, he had sympathies with Heidegger. In this famous
Yeah.
conversation, he says, I can see what Heidegger means. This bewilderment, this dread that one has when they think that anything exists. And it's a question, it doesn't have an answer. So you can actually ask questions that can't be verified. And this is something that most people know intuitively when they have moments of anxiety or dread. And so the Vienna Circle couldn't answer those questions. They were at an impasse.
Yeah, I mean he almost kind of says that one ought to be silent about these matters, but it's not clear what that means, in the sense that it could mean, you could interpret it in a classical, you could say, positivist way of saying, okay, just shut up, right? Just don't pursue this further. Or it could mean this is a domain of mysticism. This is something that cannot be captured by a logical language, but it should be further explored nonetheless in other means, by poetry, or anything else. So I find that fascinating, and also the way I often understood, as an overlap to Heidegger here, the way I often understood, when it got to the core of his thinking, that's the question of being. It's almost like a negative theology of sorts, where when a meteor lands, you do no longer find the meteor, you only find the crater. So you can kind of explore the sense of being by its kind of crater, by its kind of cultural, linguistic, whatnot, philosophical impact in our thinking, by the traces it's kind of carved into our thinking. But the meteor is no longer there. It's not something you can grasp anymore. And I think that is very interesting when you look at various other, like going back to Gödel, various other let's say implicit meanings, where you realize there is a kind of an impasse. For example, the whole debate over Gödel's and other people's ontological argument for the existence of God. And the main critique of these arguments, which within its own logic is valid, is that existence is not a positive property, right?
Yes.
But I think it goes deeper than that. It's existence. I think the people who are more, let's say, theologically motivated, or more open to, let's say, the question of being, more open to metaphysics, like Gödel, they kind of are driven by this inherent wonder of existence itself. And you even find it with certain theologians in the Muslim world. For example, Mullah Sadra is someone I've looked into for a bit, where it's not about the cause of all things. It's not about the prime mover. It's about this kind of ground of being itself. It's some, like, to recenter our focus at this fundamental mystery. That gives it its own property. That gives it its own unity, its own coherence, its own consistence. And that in essential, you could say, mood or disposition is what drives an ontological proof of the existence of God in the first place. And if you do not have that, then obviously you will say, wait. Existence is not a positive attribute or a positive property at all. Existence isn't something you can give any attributes to. So you must logically separate these things, and then you can no longer just claim that B follows from A, right?
Yes, and this is exactly the kind of analysis that Kant was applying to the notion of being. He says it's a subject without a predicate. So traditional Aristotelian logics or subject predicate logic would refute at the outset. There would be no way to verify, to predicate what being is. So he kind of passes by in the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason this question. And going back to what we said at the beginning, is that a lot of these discussions in the 20th century sort of emerge as a debate about Kant and Neo-Kantianism and the whole enterprise of epistemology. So it's interesting how much Kant is really sort of the foreground to almost all of these debates. And many people, when Einstein, made public his early work and his theories on relativity, people were comparing it to sort of Kant. It's like, well, we have Kant, we have Euclid, so how can we account for Einstein's relativity? We must make sure that these are not invalid. And everyone that tried it, Ernst Cassirer, Reichenbach is his name, a lesser known neo-Kantian, and Moritz Schlick. They all philosophically analyzed it and they found out, well, we have to accept this new paradigm, even though we have no experience that can corroborate with this. So this is the domain of which a discovery is made and yet hasn't been sort of lived through, we could say. This is sort of a mysterious element even to science, which is what is science? Knowledge, absolute knowledge. And so you have this domain in which you can only postulate or imagine what the implications are of a theory. And the way you have to imagine what it's like to feel a certain way when one has this uncanny feeling. And this goes back to metaphysics. And this is why Heidegger famously says in his address is that I'm going to dive into metaphysics by presenting a question. I don't have a definition because I want to undergo the experience of metaphysics. And so it's interesting how someone starts a paper or a talk by saying we're going to go right into thinking this in this way, rather than this is historically how this discipline has been presented. Here's an argument, and this is a good way of showing how different Heidegger's methodology is. He doesn't care about contradictions. He doesn't care about pleonasms. He'll say the nothing nos. He'll say temporality temporalizes itself. And this is why Carnap says if you take those kinds of statements and you substitute them for regular notions, the rain rains, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So their methodologies differ, and yet they both have serious concerns. So there's no reason to disavow one or the other. You can do both or neither. I mean, there's no need to delegitimize what's called continental philosophy at the expense of what would be called more rigorous scientific thinking.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I there's an argument by Gödel and then later adapted by Roger Penrose on the possibility on the comparison of human thought and machinic thought, or whether human thought can be reduced to logical formalism or technological system. And it's based on the incompleteness theorems, where he basically states that each formal logical system will entail an unprovable, an undecidability, an unprovable statement related to the liar's paradox, saying basically this statement is unprovable. And he says, well, here you have a distinction. The formal system cannot answer. For the formal system, the sentence is unprovable. For the observer, that sentence is obviously true. So for the observer, that sentence is not unprovable. So there's a whole debate about whether that proves the superiority of the phenomenal mind and the phenomenal observer, or whether there's circular reasoning involved in there. But what it shows is a kind of a separation of systems. You've got the logic, the internal logic of the system, and the possibility of the observer to make some inference about it. So for the observer, there is a separate understanding that says, oh, okay, this sentence is not provable. Within that system I'm observing, that sentence is obviously true. So I know it's true. The system does not know it's true. Does that make sense? Can you follow?
Yes, because I watched this video where Penrose unpacked this Gödel versus AI.
Right.
And the category that we like to think is intrinsically human, at least so far as we know, is understanding. So that the software cannot have, the hardware cannot have the concept of understanding. It doesn't know that it knows. You can't verify it. And like you're saying, in different domains, there will have different functions. And that was one of famous statements made by Russell, is that the present king of France is bald.
Hmm.
You know, it's sort of, well, it's not true because there is no present king of France.
Right.
What's
Okay. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
all
I
these.
mean, that's the thing. It's like, um, you know, Gandalf is the gray wizard. It's like, is the answer this is true, or is the answer no, there is no wizards, or Gandalf isn't real, right? So there is an answer to give from within the logic and outside of it, and I think that's what's happening in the separation between continental and analytical philosophy to some extent. So I would say that the analytical philosophers, they attempt to rigorously and strictly think within the system, to create a formal system and then attempt to remain within it at any cost. In a way, it's almost like you're trying to navigate through the world using only your map, not using your eyes to look around, using only the map. But what gives you the justification? That's like always the question. What gives you the justification that this map is actually orienting you correctly around the world? So you need at least one free miracle. You need at least one time in which the map is aligned with your phenomenal observation of the world, where you know, okay, I'm looking at the same direction as the map. You need at least one encounter that kind of does the matching. And that is something that they like to forget about. It's like it's this Seinsvergessenheit, the forgetting of being. There is some sort of metaphysical push that's we're still living off of, that we've forgotten about. And I think this experiment kind of exemplifies it to a certain extent, where it's like, okay, there are two actually levels of truth there. And for the observer, consistency does not equal, it's not synonymous with truth. Whereas within that system, it is. Consistency is truth. Consistency is everything. Yeah.
It's Yeah, it's formal. I mean, broadly speaking, it's more of like formal and informal truth, or truth is correctness, right? That Heidegger likes to mention, that there is this degree of which, going back to the medieval scholastics, adequatio rationis, or adequatio veritas, like adequation of truth and correctness. And if you're making a syllogistic claim, then you can verify it according to the structure of the syllogism. But what happens is analogous to the map, is that you have the syllogistic reasoning, and it doesn't allow for contingencies or unexpectancies to inform you about what you're trying to discover. It's like you have the schemata, and you don't have ways to vary it. So it's like a scholasticism for our own 20th century. We became, if taken too far, dogmatic, they're not. It's not as if they're not without blame, because in the kind of manifesto for the Vienna Circle, the scientific conception of the world, they make it clear. Otto Neurath is sort of the author, and he collaborates with Carnap and Hans Hahn and others. He says, man is the measure of all things. We believe so. We believe Protagoras. We're not Platonic. We're not Epicurean. We're not Pythagorean. We think this is the only world. Again, that immanentistic view. And so it's sort of like this very optimistic view that comes from the Enlightenment, that science will liberate us
Right.
at all costs.
Yeah. 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 Right. I mean, and what we should mention, looking at Kuhn especially, is that everything eventually becomes scholasticism. Like we it's like scholasticism is a general principle of a scientific establishment or any kind of truth generating institution. And so with time, our paradigms, some have characterized it, if you go with the Frankfurt School, it's the combination of operationalism and behaviorism, taking the hard sciences being operationalist and the soft sciences being behaviorist. That was his critique at the time, that there is a kind of a new scholasticism, a new kind of you could say quasi-metaphysical paradigm that nobody anymore, or no one within the establishment, recognizes as a metaphysical paradigm anymore, that has become the measure for truth and scientific accuracy, that if we actually take the discoveries of Popper and others seriously, have no basis in themselves. Like, they themselves are open to refutation. They themselves are always open to falsification. And Popper himself even employed a metaphor that science is not standing on firm ground, but rather within a swamp that is constantly sinking, that we constantly are placing new poles and stakes in to solidify our new ground, but we're just constantly sinking, right?
Yes.
And the question, and it's a serious and really important question, is where does that leave us? Because Feierabend, whom I'm a huge fan of, he basically went full anarchist. He basically went epistemological Unabomber in a way, and said, well, there is no method. There is no, so, like, stop looking for it. We are basically employing a multitude of methods, a diversity of methods that cannot be reduced to some core method. And any unity that there is basically institutional. It's unity that happens to be united based on the bureaucratic unity of the academic institutions, and that's it. We actually have no objective criterion that separates certain kinds of psychotherapy from Jungianism, from shamanism, in a way, to put it bluntly. But I think Heidegger, in his approach, actually went further and said, well, in a way, this destruction is necessary, but it requires us to build something new from it. It requires us to actually return to the beginning and then regrow a new path towards science. And that is something I'd really like to explore with you.
And that is very important to me as well, because I'm thinking of how we can have phenomenology, which is a method, applied to science, applied to metaphysics. So phenomenology is the method, and the need to be conversant in physics and mathematics is essential, even back to cosmological speculation, the grand question. And this is the consequence of the 20th century, when the foundations of mathematics and logic were questioned. It really took a long time for it to reach the social sciences, and this is why Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, in their own ways, are responding to these formal crises in the sciences, with Derrida's concept of the trace or difference and deconstruction, and Foucault's epistemes, sort of the frameworks, which are like paradigms of Kuhn. These are their own responses to these very important questions. So I think at times they are not treated with charitability from some of our friends or people more analytically minded. They're not really seeing that there's a coherency there in these crises. And each of these thinkers has their own response to that Heideggerian problem of that science doesn't think, and the tyranny of science that it results from that. Yeah, yes.
Yeah. I mean, that is, you're hitting a really good point there, because Gödel even spoke of it, and referring to Husserl, that phenomenology was actually an attempt to continue what Kant had started but failed to accomplish, because Kant was trying to actually go back to a kind of a priori phenomenological perspective on the world, where time and space are no longer externalities, but they're actually pure forms of perception. They're actually, in a sense, the necessary framework for any kind of perception and scientific reasoning. But the mistake he did was grounding it too much in the very contingent paradigm, you could say, of his time. So he basically assumed that the fundamental laws of space, for example, the geometric laws of Euclid, were derived from this pure form of perception. That Euclid was basically an a priori fixed structure of space that is required to perceive. In the same way, for causality, time and causality, you had these kind of Newtonian axioms that were fixed. But it didn't take long until they were superseded by general relativity, by other theories. General relativity kind of blew a hole into Newtonian mechanics as well as Euclidean geometry in a way, at least in his assumptions, which then led to the question: okay, was Kant wrong? Or was he only mistaken partially, which is what Gödel argues? He was only mistaken on the particularities of the core structure of space and time. And they are actually still given a priori, but we just become more sophisticated with time in discovering and explaining them. And that actually, you could say, is almost Hegelian in a way, where it's like this was the first step in the kind of in the thought movement that would eventually return back in its negation to its origin of then actually launching perception and scientific inquiry and derivations on a much more powerful basis after we've come back to our core assumptions about space and time or reformed them. Which I find interesting, but which has the issue that there are no brakes on that train. It's almost like it will violently come back if we kind of hop on the Hegelian machine. It'll violently come back, erode its foundations, in just the sole purpose to expand the scientific system, which doesn't take into account what we're seeing right now, namely the unique threat and danger it poses to our very existence.
Yes, and this is great. So, okay, let's think. First and foremost, you're right. Gödel has that amazing paper. It's very brief, where he says Husserl has proposed a method, phenomenology, and I'm not entirely sure how this method can be carried out. He says, I think, however, it is major significance to us in philosophy and in science. And he says Kant has been misunderstood for so long. What would happen if we actually interpreted him correctly? This would be, he says, Kant has sort of been misinterpreted, as you were saying, and as I've expressed too, that the notion of the a priori isn't refuted. It's that it was constrained by the 18th century in which it was written, as
Right.
it would have to be, because it was natural science was informing him. And Kant has a lot of early writings on science, natural science, and theoretical writings where he actually refuted absolute space from Newton as a concept. He showed that it wasn't true according to Ernst Cassirer. So
Oh,
Ernst
that's
Cassirer,
interesting. I didn't know that.
yeah. And I need to read these early writings because he was very much concerned with, he's an exemplary philosopher because he was concerned with on the theory of the heavens, on the composition of fire, on anthropology, language. These are all the foreground for his critique of pure reason. So this Kant is not wrong. He was constrained to the time in which he lived, which we all are if we're honest about it.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. And I mean, I think the big question is, how can you liberate yourself? And I think that's what Heidegger's greatest achievement is, or contribution is. How can you disentangle yourself? And he calls it Verwindung. It's like a disentanglement. It's not an overcoming. It's not Überwindung. It's not Nietzschean. It's not willing itself. How do you disentangle yourself from this dialectic without ending up becoming another or triggering another dialectic within that paradigm? I mean, you brought up Foucault earlier, and I'm Foucault. I like some of Foucault's writings, and I'm a fan of Noam Chomsky, and I saw their debate. But I had to admit that Foucault had a much deeper point to make than Chomsky, because Chomsky was always referring to some sense of justice that's being kind of betrayed by our systems, But that sense of justice, as Foucault says, where does it come from? That sense of justice comes from these very same systems. It's the systems that were built in throughout the Enlightenment and the revolutions, our political systems. They were built on this same sense of justice that Chomsky is kind of referring to, that he's feeling is being betrayed. So it is within that dialectic, and you see it in a lot more things. Like once that clicked for me, it was like it cannot be unseen. I was like, okay, wait a minute. He's a very effective and I would say worthwhile critic of American imperialism. But he has a professor position in one of the most prestigious universities of the United States. So he is at the core of American institutions. And it's like, how can that be? And then on the other hand, those who favor American imperialism, those who are in favor of the war machine, or what you want to call it, they will argue saying, hey, all those countries, all those other countries, they would never allow Chomsky to be a professor. You know, we actually are better than them. We actually are justified in our crusade because, see, we got people like Chomsky in a professor position and no one arrests him for his opinions. So in a way, it's like a twisted, you know what I mean? It's like a ironic, twisted way that Chomsky is actually somehow a tool or an aid to this whole imperial system. And once I realized that it cannot be unseen, and Möller, Hans-Georg Möller from the YouTube channel Carefree Wandering, he even speaks about this in his media theory, saying that like Chomsky never reflects on the fact that most people will use media, especially now, will use mass media to find his work, to read about manufacturing consent and all that. What does that mean? Right?
I agree. I actually wrote this satirical poem called Manufactured Dissent because I feel like he was a pro-establishment figure. He always has been. I've been suspicious about him, and I've always favored Foucault's critique of him and Foucault's analysis over that of Chomsky, because at least Chomsky's guilty of what many people are of. He sort of just wants to assert the status quo, and he's an apologist for the Democratic Party at the end of the day. And he doesn't really change his position. It's sort of that's what it seems like to me. Is very transparently just pro Washington D.C. and the elites of the United States. And even though he still has valid critiques, like you said, of imperialism, it's not to say he doesn't have valid arguments. It's just more so I don't feel like he has the same integrity that Foucault has, which a lot of people wouldn't like me even saying that.
Well, to tie it back to our conversation about positivism, you could say that plenty of empirical statements of Chomsky are true, but the metaphysical core seems to be misaligned, and
Yes.
it seems to be and it's something. It's a real question whether, like, if we move back from politics to our scientific discussion, which is more interesting. It's a real question. How do you avoid not ending up in the dialectic? And I think this affirmation of pseudoscience, this kind of, actually, I do consult my crystals or my star sign rather than my doctor. I think that almost is a kind of reactive position that is too much within the paradigm. I think it needs to go deeper. It needs to be more sophisticated. And I do see the beginning of it somewhat in Husserl and Heidegger, but I think it's still very, very, it's like we're moving from a fully developed system, a fully developed, you could say, call it a quarry in this metaphor, to a tiny mine that we have one candle and a pickaxe to continue exploring. And Husserl and Heidegger have just gone maybe 100 meters in. And so we have not much of a leg to stand on to advocate that this is much better than that massive quarry that we've been running for the years. But we kind of know that this quarry won't be operational for much longer. And so we need people who already are seeing that coming and have started the groundwork. And to put it more concretely, we've mentioned that in one of our previous episodes. It's this Where does our sense of space come from? Could it be that this assumption that space is some sort of infinitely dense geometrical receptacle with an infinite amount of continuous points in space, could it be that that is actually secondary? Could it be that that is something that was derived and we've just taken it for granted? But there is actually some kind of more fundamental phenomenological origin, some fundamental phenomenon, or some, you could say, a priori or subjective encounter, that where our sense of space is rooted, and that is kind of currently in collision. That's you see it, you see
Yes.
it actually most hilariously in the flat Earth debates. It's in a way it's in collision with the scientific perspective, and it's and I think it's a real serious question to tackle, to say what happens if we assume that actually space is not fundamental but place is. Like, I have a place, I there is a meaningful connection between this place and another place, and that meaningful connection can be how long it takes me to walk there, how what I feel, who I know over there. There's a lot of meaningful connections, and if you strip all of the others away, you strip all of that metaphysical baggage or meaningful baggage, which I wouldn't call baggage, but you strip it away in order to arrive at something scientific, at something more sterile, as the positivists want it, then we still remain at some meaningful connection between this place and another place. And we and what we then need to reckon with is that this abstract space that has been the paradigm of an infinite density of points, that's something we projected. That's something we've projected into it, but there is no way of us ever observing or perceiving an infinite amount of space points, right?
Yes. Alfred North Whitehead was very clear on critiquing this notion of fixed place, fixed position, spatial determination. He has the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You say, yeah, this is a fixed point in space, but how would you measure it? Well, you know it in relation to another point. And then there's the convergence or divergence between these points, whether they're atoms or two human beings. Because for Whitehead, those are kind of each event. There's a maxi event and a micro event. They're kind of mirroring each other. So you only know space in relation to the confluence of events coming in, and there's these points of divergence that will just happen spontaneously, and that's more a picture. It's more phenomenological of how we live and comport ourselves in space. And this is why phenomenology is helps elucidate the problem of my relation to the world, or as Merleau-Ponty says, motricity, like my way of comporting myself through the world. That's primary. That's prior to my understanding of physics per se. So it's a matter of looking to the right criteria when you need to have your answers, your problem solved. If you want to understand space as it is lived, then you can't necessarily have recourse to physics for elucidating your problem. You might ask yourself, well, how do I reach the church from my home to the town yard? What is my walk from here to there? And these are the kind of images that not only Heidegger but also the poets have already done in the work of the Romantic poets. They have, in their own way, described the world with the suffused with sentiment and with care. And so there is really no reason to try to refute the poets, but ask yourself, is this actually more in keeping with my understanding of care and my notion of dwelling? And the poets can answer this. And maybe the philosopher should be more versed in the poets than he should in physics and geometry and these matters. So I think this is the kind of question that a phenomenologist wants to ask. How should I go about asking these questions? And how do I look at the right discipline when I have a problem that needs solved.
Right, and I think the whole problem of measurement becomes clear here. I mean, take the globe. Why is the depiction of the globe the way it is? Because any depiction of the globe is a gross distortion. It's some kind of geometric projection, actually very related to differential geometry. The methods of deriving these kind of projections come from differential geometry, which is the field that general relativity is based on, or the mathematical field that the mathematical framework for general relativity has come from. But it's always a distortion, but we obviously have a kind of a clear image in our mind when we think of a map of a globe. And that is because there is a meaningful way of portraying it to us that is, often centered around Europe. It's often structured in a way that no continent is cut in half or something like that. It's often set up so the most clearly or accurately represented areas are those of the most interest, you could say, or of the most population. So there's even meaning there. It's not a measurement or a depiction that's stemming out of nowhere. And I haven't even gotten into our time measurements, when the year begins, what kind of sections we have to measure time and all these things. But all of these have consequences. As soon as we decide to measure, and as soon as we set the standard for measurement, we actually kind of color it in a certain way, and our thinking will derive from it without us knowing. There's a certain unconscious aspect to it, and I think here we have the same situation when where does space begin, where does it end? Well, you set the standard in the place you are now. The anchor is set in the place, not in the space. And that's like all of the mystery around interpreting quantum mechanics is resolved by this, because you're basically saying, okay, the measurement during the measurement, I am setting the standard for that measurement, because the quantum world doesn't work that way, that there is a pre-existing standard. It's set in the process of measurement. There is no hidden local variable. There is no, so we set it in the, it's almost as if you imagine that a new form of electromagnetism is being discovered every time we measure it. And then every time you measure it, you get to decide whether that's positive or negative charge. And then you don't really get to be surprised that if you have two attracting particles, and I measure one and you measure the other, I don't get to be surprised to be like, hey, what a coincidence that our measurements are correlated. I measured a positive one and you measure a negative one, and vice versa. How are they correlate? We don't get to be surprised about it if we think of it that way, that we've set the standard. I've set the standard that this is now positive. It could be the other way around. It could be symmetrical. But just like I said with Gotthard Günther and our notions of truth and falsehood, it never really is. With humans, it never really is symmetrical. There is always some meaningful charge, some meaningful valence to it. And that's kind of how we need to move forward when considering finding a new basis for fundamental research.
That's fantastic. I think this could be, we could elucidate it with the notion from Atman Spacker and Dean Rickles as the psychophysically neutral. So if I'm asking what is time, and I'm a physicist, that I'm looking for the measurement and I'm looking for a way to reproduce that way of measuring. But if I now change the question and say, what is time for me as a finite being, one who is pressed with finitude, that is an adult, that has one's own mortality ahead of me, then it sort of becomes what Heidegger called temporality. Mm-hmm. So they're both correct. And what you can do is, as we said before, you can draw your attention to one of these categories and you can prioritize them, and that becomes central to your consciousness. But when you're asking what is temporality, you're changing already because you're concerned with it in a different context
Right.
and a very much more serious way. And this is another way of looking at Carnap and Heidegger. And this contemporary scholar put it very well. He said, with Carnap, we should be reading Frege at the desk. We should be reading Einstein, but at bedside we should have Zarathustra and Rilke's poems. So there's this depending on your inquiry, you have to have the acumen to know what's going to help guide your inquiry for the results you're looking for. But anytime you try to shave off one of the categories, you're actually distorting reality, or better yet, distorting your experience. Because this is what phenomenology is concerned with, my lived experience. So this is why it's such a difficult subject for analytic philosophers to describe, because when you're talking about subjectivity in the sense of my experience of phenomena, how do you verify these claims, these categories?
Yeah, and I think a huge part here is this: it requires courage. It requires courage to be, because obviously it's not clear whether you are the next Galileo. You know, it's always safer to follow the scholasticism of the time. It's not clear whether you're completely going down the wrong path because it's not been discovered before. Whether you're actually going to be the next Galileo or not, and I think the what you just said, having the Zarathustra at your bedside table, it kind of reminds you of this vastness within which you find this tiny blip of the scientific scholasticism that kind of has totalized itself. You know, the positivists have kind of caged themselves into their system. In a way that it cannot conceive of anything outside of it. Any formal system cannot conceive of anything outside of it. It actually sounds much more like or at least I am bashing the positivists more than we're really reconciling them. But in this part, but I mean, you know, take Nietzsche's critique of something like Darwinism, and I would say that extends. With time, if he'd been around and interested in it, it would extend probably to psychoanalysis and psychology and Freudianism as well. That is, you've basically created a framework to analyze biological development and behavior by looking at how it acts during survival, how it acts in order to survive. And then you've reduced everything else about life to the survival mechanism. And, you know, in a way, you know, obviously it's been a very productive theory, Darwinism, a theory of evolution. But in a way, what Nietzsche is addressing, there is something sick about it. There, you know what I mean? There is something dysfunctional about that approach. And it's the same with Freudianism in the sense that you are deriving what you know about the human mind and psyche from how he acts in despair and anxiety and sickness in a way, or how it acts based on its base desires, on its base drives, and I think we need to expand this to even physics, that even the hard sciences can suffer of such things. If you look at this whole notion of, okay, we basically try and generate a model of the universe that is as empty as possible, as vast and empty as possible, lacking any telos and lacking any creator. But never mind the 70% dark matter that we cannot account for, and the 90-something% of dark energy we cannot account for. Which, you know, where's Popper? Is this not like, should that not be already enough to falsify something? I don't know. You know what I mean? It's like, how does that meet any standard if like 70% of matter cannot be accounted for example? But we're holding on to that paradigm. We're holding on to this, okay, we've got this infinitely vast, empty space of infinite points, of vast empty points of space.
Yes.
And it's crushing, it's just crushing. We are actually, we are rounding error. We're nothing in this, we're like,
I'm surprised that this hasn't been critiqued, at least hasn't been critiqued significantly, because again, Whitehead would be concerned with this scientific abstraction, because he would say, how does this map out on concrete experience, if anything? Because he gives the analogy that when we're doing philosophy, we should be steering between these two poles, like we talked about last episode: concrete experience and scientific abstractions. So he says temporarily we need to sort of soar above the clouds when we're speculating, and then come back down eventually. And perhaps we've reached a new precedence in scientific research where these sort of concepts, whether it's dark matter or energy, the most vague concept in contemporary physics, you can't really find empirical corroborative claims or concepts that speak to intuition. I mean, I know this is one of the basic presuppositions you have to accept, is that quantum mechanics does not speak to everyday intuition and common sense experience most of the time.
yeah. And I mean, we're getting back to the problem of space. The revolution, or you could say the fall of the last big scholastic establishment, was brought about by severing the separation of the heavens and the earth. So showing basically, first with Copernicus, but then more elaborately through Johannes Kepler, that heavenly bodies followed the same laws as regular bodies, and there is, as above so below, hermetic, occult, whatever. But I mean, like, there is a certain you could say one of the early breakthroughs from away from the old scholastic establishment was this erosion of this barrier. But it has actually only pushed this barrier further out, because you can obviously look at the limited system of our solar system and look at it in terms of abstract space. But once you come to the universe as a whole, this kind of breaks down, because by definition, outside of the universe, there is no space. So where is that universe located in? These are all pointless questions. These are all questions with no answer, and they're in themselves contradictory. But what does it mean that this universe is expanding? What does that
Or that
mean? What does that even...
cosmological constant, yeah, is it expanding, or is it recoiling, or is there even a way to determine? Like, yes, this
What is
is
it
right.
expand? What is it expanding in? What is it expanding towards? Where was it before it expanded into this place? What was there before? None of these questions make any sense. Suddenly, you are looking at the universe, and suddenly you realize, okay, our idea of vacuum, of empty space vacuum, it just breaks down catastrophically when we start looking at it on the level of the whole universe. No one can really make sense of that. And so, yeah, we are looking at a conundrum, and we are looking at something that I think needs to be integrated. This is the true the true as above so below. That is Gödel's assumption that perhaps there's not only not incompleteness, the term from quantum mechanics, in what's it called, uncertainty. Not only is there potentially uncertainty on the smallest scales, but perhaps there is an uncertainty on the largest scales as well, and that is the key. That is the uniting principle. Or at least is the hint that can lead us to the uniting principle, where maybe the universe is not out there at all. Maybe the universe is a Kantian assumption we need to make to engage in science, and it's way more phenomenological, it's way more down here inside than we think, which doesn't mean it's pseudoscientific or wrong or
Yeah.
I've disproven it. It's an entirely different argument. It's disentangled from this dialectic. It's not, I'm not saying it to scientifically disprove it. I'm not advocating some other theory in the same vein instead of it. I'm actually advocating a reinterpretation, a re-understanding, rediscovery of what these theories have meant all along, kind of retrospectively, by placing them within a broader context that is no longer purely physical. That's what we're doing.
Yes. That's the way to do philosophy is taking the questions that have been primordial and reinterpreting them like Heidegger did so well. He's exemplary in that sense. Very few philosophers have said we should go back to Heraclitus and Parmenides and reinterpret Aristotle even, which is iconoclastic in itself, getting Aristotle out of the traps of scholasticism and Christianity in order to understand the Greek conception of being. And so, questions have to be raised again. And I'm thinking of David Bohm too, with his concept of wholeness, which he says isn't a fixed line of inquiry. We're not going to reach wholeness, yet it's the guiding principle. It makes science possible. So in the way that Kant, yeah, we could even do what John Locke had proposed, which I've often thought of as a guiding principle, is the orderedness of nature. It exists if we're able to, collect our data correctly. We can show that there is an orderedness and a unity to nature. And this is the presupposition that at least the positivists were operating under the unity of science, which sounds
Yes.
very optimistic and utopian now. I think that they're in their own way, they're just raising the questions from the Enlightenment once again. It's a perennial, in a colloquial sense, it's a perennial problem for humanity to become scientific enlightened. Researchers of the scientific enlightenment off sort of like the after effect. We sort of become optimistic again, and then we propose new ways of research, and then we make dogmatic assertions like we've solved all the problems that need to be solved, which people had said in the 19th century that we've essentially done everything we need to do in physics, and now we can sort of rest content. I don't think it was Maxwell that said that. It was probably Ernst Mach before had similar ideas. Like we basically know how to study the world, and he said atoms don't exist. By the way,
Right, right,
poor
right, right.
Boltzmann. Boltzmann had to face the problem of what you're kind of alluding to, is that the constraints of the scholastic paradigm don't allow for this new discovery. That because the prejudices are so limiting that the research can't even be funded, can't be carried out. And this will probably happen over and over again. Like there's a limit reached, scientific consensus has a limit, and then no one can refute it because they're not even given the the voice, if you want to put it, the platform.
Yeah,
I think
and
David Bohm.
I would argue as well that potentially a kind of, a departure from the scholasticism will require some kind of new institution building, a new forms. You can never really escape the development of technology, and in the same way there will be new forms or new optimal forms of education, research, transmission of ideas, an encounter of ideas, new ways of debate and exchange. And I think we're at the forefront of it, and that allows for some kind of optimism. I would say it is exciting in many ways. I'd say without this technology, you and I would have never met, for example.
Precisely.
And so that's some at minimum a fair basis for optimism. And I would suggest that we'll tackle the topic of wholeness. That's something I really want to get deep into and don't want to just glance over it in a few minutes. So I suggest we tackle that in the next episode. And
Yes.
for now, I'll say goodbye, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Absolutely. This is going to be great. Thank you.